The Water District Representative Caucus and a special meeting of the Board of Directors. And we're going to start out with seeing if we have a quorum, which I believe we do, but Mr. General Manager.
Yes, thank you very much, President Alvarez. Director Scott Houston. Here. Director Don Deere. Here. Director Gloria Gray.
Here.
Director Harold Williams. Here. President Desi Alvarez.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay, do we have any public comment?
Mr. President, we have not received any requests for public comment, though this meeting is being held both in person and virtually. If anybody would like to make public comment, now would be the time to do so. Please indicate so by raising your hand or your virtual hand if you're joining us virtually. And I do not see any request for public comment.
Okay, move on to discussion item. Today is the climate adaptation master plan for water, year one progress report. General Manager, would you like to introduce that item, please?
Yes, thank you very much. We are very lucky to have Liz Croson, the Chief Sustainability, Resilience, and Innovation Officer for Metropolitan Water District, here for a one-year progress report on the Climate Adaptation Master Plan for Water, or otherwise known as CAMP for Water. So with that, I'm happy to hand it over to Liz.
Welcome, Liz.
Thank you, EJ, and thank you, Director Alvarez and members of this board. It's a pleasure to be back here and share with you the progress that we've made over the last year. I want to start out by thanking Director Alvarez as well as EJ and his team and the many members of your West Basin Caucus that participate in a really thoughtful, meaningful, and constructive way in the Camp for Water process. It's been over a year now, a really robust dialogue. And we've been able to really work in an iterative way to make sure that we're incorporating the comments and thoughts of our member agencies and board members as we've moved forward in this process. So just to remind you of kind of where we started, we as staff were directed by the board to integrate the way that we do planning at Metropolitan. So to ensure that our water resources planning and our finance is really through and integrated with what we do on climate planning. And so that's what we embarked on. And I'm going to share with you the progress that we've made to date. Next slide, please. So you can find our one-year progress report on our website. It is, I think it's about 60 pages. And the way I broke it down on this slide is these are by the different sections that are included in that progress report. And those blue sections, the executive summary through section 3, are really all about the progress that we've made, what we've done so far. And in that red-orange color are the next steps that we are now working on in 2024 and will likely continue through 2025. So I'm going to walk through a few of these sections just to give you a very high-level background. I'm happy to dig in deeper into any of the topics if you have additional questions. So next slide, please. So I'm going to skip over executive summary and the background section. Those sections, well, the executive summary speaks for itself. Section 1 is really about the background and the reasons behind doing the Camp for Water process at Metropolitan and at all of our member agencies. I think we all recognize at this point that the climate impacts are real and are affecting our operations. They're affecting our infrastructure. And they're certainly really compelling us to think differently about our resources. So that section really explains some of that climate science and background and the drivers behind this plan. Section 2 is really the heart and soul of the Camp for Water process. This is where we're developing a climate decision-making framework. And this, in my mind, is really one of the primary outcomes of this process is that Metropolitan is developing a way to evaluate projects and programs that ensures that we're not just thinking about its cost effectiveness, which will still be included, but that we're also thinking about how this project or program performs in a climate changed environment, how it supports reliability in the long term, how it provides environmental and equity co-benefits. And so this decision-making framework includes evaluative criteria that we'll use to evaluate our projects and programs moving forward. We have also started to develop a set of targets. So a lot of plans that you see around, whether it's a climate action plan, an adaptation plan, a sustainability plan, sets forth targets and goals so that we know what the North Stars are that we're driving towards. And so we've started to do that for water supply, for core supply, for storage. We've also included some policy-based targets around ensuring we get equitable supply reliability. You all are very aware with what happened with the State Water Project dependent areas. And so we have a policy target around ensuring that doesn't happen again. We also have policy targets around conservation and water use efficiency. And I want to mention both on the evaluative criteria and the time-bound targets. These are our initial thinking that have gone through a lot of discussion and iterations and back and forth. But it is still an iterative process. And so we will continue to refine and adjust as new information or as practice, the practice of using them demands. We are certainly open to changing and adjusting over time. And so what I want to make clear about the climate decision-making framework is moving forward after the end of 2024, projects and programs moving through MET will have a Camp for Water score associated with them. And that score will explain how a project performs on reliability, on resilience, on financial sustainability, but that doesn't spit out the answer. The board still retains its discretion to make the decision, the ultimate decisions on investments. And I think that's a really important component and acknowledgement for our board. Next slide, please. So that's the decision-making framework. And then the next question is often, at least at our board level, so are all projects? I mean, Metropolitan has a lot of activities going on. We have basic R&R. We're always fixing infrastructure or upgrading particular conveyance systems or pumps. And so we at Metropolitan have started to really dig into what projects are actually going to be evaluated through the Camp for Water process to really meet the intention here. And so the intention here was that those projects that are addressing climate adaptation should be evaluated through CAMP. So those basic R&R projects, those will continue through their current process, through our CIP process, through our CIP scoring process. And it's only those projects that are really addressing climate adaptation that will go through the the Camp for Water evaluation process. And I'll show you on the next slide a few of the threshold questions that we've been using to kind of make this determination on whether a project or program gets evaluated using that climate decision-making framework. So one, is the project actually providing a new core supply, a flex supply, or storage, or enabling one of those things? Two, is it addressing a climate or a known vulnerability that we have? So a known climate vulnerability. And does it involve improvements above and beyond what would be considered your basic R&R? We're also in the process of considering a either or both a flow-based threshold and or a cost-based threshold. So we certainly don't want to slow projects down, especially smaller projects that need that can move through without this more robust evaluation. And so we are actually in the middle of developing some thoughts around this threshold, and we will be presenting on this issue to our board, to our task force at the end of June, to really try to make it very clear what goes through the CAMP process and what does not. Next slide, please. And so the sections 4 through 6 of the Year 1 Progress Report really talk about the next steps around the business model and affordability, policies, initiatives, and partnerships, and adaptive management. And I do want to mention that when this Camp for Water task force was formed at our board level, the board approved a charter, and that charter lays out the components of what this climate adaptation plan. That includes these sections within the CAMP report. And so I'm going to talk about each of these. The first one, just briefly, just so you can get a taste of what it is that we're talking about when it comes to actually developing some of these things over the next several months. Next slide, please. So the business model conversation is in itself, obviously, a very significant undertaking. And it is one that cannot likely be wholly discussed within the Camp for Water process. However, it is inextricably linked to the Camp for Water process. One of the many drivers to refining Metropolitan's business model is because of the climate conditions that we face. That isn't the only driver of business model refinement, but is certainly one of the big ones. And so that business model conversation will likely take a parallel form to the conversations we're having around Camp for W, but it will also be woven in at various points because it's really important. And that you'll see that there are actually elements that are both business model considerations and climate adaptation strategies. And so it is really important that these conversations continue to be linked. So in the year one progress report, we kind of have some guiding principles around why it is that we are addressing the business model. This is not a complete list, but it's certainly a starting point as our board has started to enter into this conversation. And I want to also mention that although myself and my team is leading the Camp for Water and the climate adaptation planning process, the business model conversation is being led out of the general manager's office with his chief of staff and the finance office. So there really is a high level team across the general manager's purview that is working on both of these planning processes in a way that is integrated. So some of the issues that have, risen to the top, bubbled up to be discussed in the business model conversation, including dealing with equity and fairness among the member agencies. And one of the major issues that's been raised is the treatment surcharge, but that's certainly not the only one that has been raised in terms of ensuring equity and fairness. We've also had robust conversations about ensuring that we're actually capturing the value of conservation. I think one of the sometimes overstated conclusions of what we see when we see lower retail sales is that that's because of conservation. And I think that what's really important is to recognize that when we save water during those dry periods or even wet periods, that what we result having a lot more storage available when we really need it. And there's actually a value of that stored, conserved water that we can effectuate at a later date. And so that's a really important conversation in terms of conservation and local water resources development that I know you all have been leaders on. And you can see some of these other kind of guiding principles around exchanging water between member agencies, expanding regional benefits, giving support, ensuring we're giving support to our members, in addition to finding new revenue streams, which is something that my office in particular has been really focused on in terms of looking at our lands and renewable energy opportunities, as well as new grant and loan opportunities. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the policies, initiatives, and partnerships, these are just a few of the examples of where Metropolitan and our board and member agencies have identified we need to really think about new policies. And so my office is going to be focused on that in the next several months. Next slide, please. And when it comes to partnerships, I think this is a place that you all will be really interested in hearing about. We have a longstanding partnership relationship with all our member agencies, and we're looking at some new ways to partner. And for a long time, demand management has been one of those priorities, but we're also looking at within our water resources team, surplus water management, member agency exchange. Are there changes and improvements to our local resources program that could benefit not only our climate adaptation, but also play a role in business model development, community engagement, partnering with you all on that. And we did just stand up a new regional network on grants and technical assistance to support our member agencies there. Next slide, please. And then there's potential external partnerships. So we've done, we've had some really interesting new partnerships with agencies like Southern Nevada and Central Arizona Project, and their interest in actually investing in the planning around the Pure Water Project, for example, because they see the benefit to helping us reduce our reliance on the Colorado River and how that might help their agencies out in times of need, and as well as new partnerships with business and ag and community-based organizations, environmental organizations, and academic institutions. We have a lot of examples about about how we do that in the past and how we really want to build on that to further our climate adaptation goals. Next slide, please. And then lastly, the progress report lays out a process for adaptive management. For a long time, Metropolitan has done integrated resources planning. You're very familiar with our IRP, and which has been very successful in ensuring that we provide the reliability that you all require. At the same time, I think we recognize that times are less certain than they have been in the past. And so we're creating a framework where we are going to be more nimble and more flexible to be able to really track real world impacts and be able to adjust when needed. So as opposed to just laying out sort of a line of a trajectory of this is how much water we think we need, or this is how much storage or what we need to invest in, we are building a system where we can actually adjust when needed if conditions change or do not proceed the way that we might have anticipated. Next slide, please. And the way that we've done that is instead of a single scenario, we're using scenario planning to ensure that we actually are looking at the potential of multiple future outcomes. Our board has decided to plan towards the most extreme of these 4 scenarios in this graph at this point, but that certainly does not mean we're building to that scenario. It only means that that is the outlook that we're using for towards 2045. But along the way, we will have the ability to adjust and make decisions that might mean we need less water than we thought. It might mean that demands are lower than we anticipated. It might mean that the economy is growing more than we thought, or maybe it's growing in certain areas and decreasing in other areas. So that type of information could help inform and refine the targets that we're trying to reach, the investments that we're making. So it really does provide us the ability to be much more nimble and flexible and really more informed using the best available climate science. Next slide, please. These are just some of the signposts and metrics that I was just mentioning that we'll be tracking in order to make sure that we're using the best available information. And what we've committed to as staff, in the past, we've done an IRP every 5 years. We are changing that up to make sure that we're checking these types of signposts on an annual basis. Not all of these change on an annual basis. Climate projections, for instance, are not changing that dramatically, that quickly. But we will have an annual report that will provide updated information that is available. And so our board is well informed about any changes or unanticipated results that we need to think about and perhaps refine any of the components of our plan. And in addition to demand and supply, which is kind of the traditional signposts that we tracked, we've also added infrastructure, because that's a really important part of building resilience, is thinking about our power infrastructure, any losses or incapacity of our infrastructure, as well as the connectivity and anything we've learned about that, as well as the financial trends that, again, those are trends that our finance team tracks on a regular basis, but here we are really integrating that thinking into our climate adaptation planning. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. This just kind of gives you a snapshot of what we'll be talking about in 2024 and the beginning of 2025. Really focused on refining that climate decision-making framework, developing some policies and initiatives, partnerships and programs, the adaptive management framework, and then you can kind of see that culminate in that first Camp for Water annual report, and then the community engagement piece is ongoing throughout all of these processes. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I have some supplemental slides if you want to dig into any details, but again, I really appreciate the ability to share with you the progress that we've made to date. It's been a really excellent collaborative conversation. I really appreciate your engagement.
Thank you. That was very good. So we'll start with the board. Any questions, comments? Director Deere, we'll start with you.
A lot of work ahead of us, I think. That's all. Congratulations.
You knew I'd have something. No, thank you so much, Liz. I'll just start it off because I'm sure there'll be some other great questions, but just off the top of my head, because, Metropolitan's so massive, of course, but have some of the other very large water, agencies, distributors, et cetera, in the United States, have they already been going through this? I don't want to call it an exercise, but, have they already been going through this, or are they looking to you all to see what we're doing, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. A little of both. There's definitely agencies that have done some version of this. Some like Denver Water or Portland, Seattle. But Metropolitan is is pretty unique in not only being a wholesaler, but also having such a large geographic scope, as well as just our operational reach, that ours is more complicated. And so we are definitely engaged with others through multiple associations that we're associated with. And we brought in a utility panel to our board, to the task force, in the middle of last year, where we brought in the Central Arizona Project to talk about their climate adaptation strategy. And then we brought in a couple electric utilities. So we brought in PG&E and Edison. And although, they're regulated differently and they're different, they have been mandated by the state to do climate vulnerability and adaptation planning. And so they had some really interesting lessons learned that we were able to share with the board. But I do think that a lot of agencies are looking to what we're doing. And I think that we have a real potential to help inform some regional planning as well, and hopefully to help inform member agency planning.
No, that's great. And, I would assume that different ones here and there are doing things, maybe East Coast or, in the Midwest and out in the West. But you all really have taken it full throttle, thanks to the board, of course, and really pushing that. And it's important. And the other question I had, and going back to the slide prior to this, I think, slide 13 with that one. So infrastructure obviously is very important, and I think you listed some great notices right there about unexpected shutdowns, emergency preparedness, power interruptions. So, all of these are the things that really did happen in the Woolsey fire, right? Malibu, Topanga, those areas. So I'm sure that these are front and center when you think about the resiliency of Metropolitan's owned and operated facilities, let alone, who the local retailer is. But can you talk about that for a minute? Because I think that was a huge lesson learned for a lot of folks, number one. But then number two, it just shows you that's probably likely the types of scenarios we're going to experience in different regions of Southern California in the future. So can you let us know just a little bit of how you all are thinking about it, let alone addressing that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great point. And I think, Met for a long time has done a great job at planning around drought cycles. And I think one of the reasons that this camp process has been so important is to think about those other climate threats as well. Because like you said, even though we are a water wholesaler, we have facilities all over the place. And some of those are in some of those high intensity fire zones. As well as subject to flooding and, other hazards. So last year, we actually experienced a fire near one of our facilities out towards the DVL area, the Debbie Valley Lake area as well. And so that was a real eye opener. I think, we were looking at evacuations and so we actually have a team that we're kicking off to kind of think about the fire management strategies for all our facilities district wide. And so that's one of the places where it's like, this comprehensive camp process helps. What it helps ensure is that all of the different kind of components of MET are looking at their operations and their facilities and infrastructure through this climate lens. And so there will be all these kind of action items that come out of it, like fire management plans for our facilities, which are outdated, as well as, flood control actions. And And so, we have a really robust emergency response team. It's just a matter of kind of folding everybody into this same, comprehensive look. But it's a really good point and something we're certainly thinking about.
Good, thank you. I'm done. Thank you.
You're
No,
done?
I'm done for now. Thank you.
Director Gray, do you have any questions?
No, thank you. Just thank you for the report.
We have quite a few staff here and, I don't know if anybody has questions, but this would be the time to either raise your questions, or comments.
Yeah, Liz,
Director, yeah.
so you said your process will start beginning of the calendar year. Is that
Well,
25
no,
or is it starting
it has, so
immediately?
the process of developing the plan started last February. But what we are hoping is that by January of 2025, we will have the climate decision-making framework ready to start evaluating projects. Because another one of those drivers of this process was because Metropolitan has so many big decisions ahead of it.
Mhm.
We have, several big projects. It's no secret, Delta Conveyance is coming, Sites Reservoir is coming, Pure Water consideration, in addition to others. And so all of those projects will be evaluated using this climate decision-making framework.
Yeah, that's where I was getting to.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So how is your department collaborate with the finance department? Like with the budget or which project is going to be doing or not doing? How do you communicate with each other?
So we've developed an internal Camp for Water planning team that includes high-level managers from finance, from water resources, from operations, from engineering, from external affairs, from sustainability, and from diversity, equity, inclusion, and Bay Delta. And so we meet on a weekly basis. And so the development, everything you see in this report has been collaboratively developed and vetted by all of those groups. So that is the only way that this really works, is that if we really break down the silos and work on this together. And so that has been the intent from the beginning and continues to be.
And some of the idea has already implemented into your current budget and then the next year to your budget?
Yeah, somewhat, but again, this process is still in, it's still in development. And so there are some projects that specifically came out of the State Water Dependent Area Group to address climate, to address drought. And some of those have already moved through our CIP because I think we all recognized and the board really committed to addressing that issue. But there are still additional projects that came out of that process that will be evaluated through the Camp for Water decision-making framework.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Liz, so you mentioned a little bit kind of about the process and the task force, and we found the task force to be an increasingly good forum for which discussion and dialogue happens between the board and the member agency managers. So I guess my question is, this idea of splitting it off into a parallel process or having it, kind of run in tandem, is the current thought that continues through the task force, that the task force would discuss both the business model and Camp for Water kind of simultaneously? Or I guess what's the current thought on how the business model and the Camp for Water continue? Is it the same group? Is it a different group? I guess kind of what are your guys' thoughts on that at the moment?
Yeah, so we are figuring that out.
Okay.
We have some conversations going on this week. Obviously, we got really good feedback from the task force last week. My thought is that we have a pretty packed schedule for the task force already laid out for 2024 to ensure that we have this climate decision-making framework ready for the board to be able to use it. And so that's, you know, one of my top priorities. And so I think it's really important that business model updates occur at the task force, maybe not at every meeting. But there's going to have to be some other robust robust conversations in some other forum as well. I don't know what that is yet.
Okay, I appreciate that.
That's, I mean, you know,
Yeah, I
I
think,
think ultimately it's going to be up to the board leadership to make that decision though.
yeah, I think one thing that's, we've seen, and I think other member agencies would agree as well, that dialogue has been really helpful to kind of refine thoughts and work
Yeah.
through that process and have both representation from the board and from the managers to get that, the policy level and the technical level. So that seems to be an effective process. It seems like they have momentum. It seems like that, you know, I think from the member agency perspective, continuing that seems to be a good forum to kind of push things
Mhm.
forward, even if there's supplemental conversations to help add to that. I think that's been really productive. So
Yeah.
something to maybe pass along to board
Yeah.
leadership.
And I totally
Yeah.
agree. I think it has gotten to a really good place. And so I want to build on that, for sure.
Thanks.
Follow up, just because I think hearing the word business model might be new to some folks, be it staff or directors. Could you kind of maybe just provide a little more of the picture of the two different?
Sure.
We are planning to have more discussion on the business model here at a future caucus meeting, but it'd be good to just kind of set the stage.
Yeah, I can certainly give you my perspective. I think it really depends on who you ask. But I think from Metropolitan's perspective, Metropolitan has been very successful at selling water and collecting revenue and being able to run its operations in order to continue to do so for almost 100 years. And I think what we're seeing now, especially with the kind of whiplash of climate change between dry and wet weather and the changes in demands, but also changes in the availability and predictability of our supplies, that perhaps the way that we've collected revenues is not as sustainable as it once was. And I think you can see that if you look at the volatility of our finances. And so the way that I've been sort of thinking about how we might refine the business model is to look at, yes, the rates and charges. Is there something that needs to be fixed amongst the proportion of fixed to volumetric? And that's something that our board talked about during the budget process and made an adjustment based on that. Are there additional operational controls or cost constraints, cost containment that we could employ, efficiencies basically? And I'm really interested in that from a sustainability perspective as well. If there are additional efficiencies that could reduce our costs. And then lastly, are there new revenue sources that maybe we haven't been thinking about? And so, you know, that's a place where I think Metropolitan actually has a ton of potential of looking at some new revenue sources, whether that's different services that we provide or different ways of managing the land that we own. And we've gotten increasingly good at getting funds from the state and federal government. That also fluctuates with political times, but so those are kind of the three ways I'm thinking about potential shifts to the business model. I think, you know, one simplistic way I've heard some people say is, you know, we're kind of going from this like commodity based, we sell water, to let's think about the services we provide. And if there is an additional way to think about the way that Metropolitan operates in our service area. But there are a lot of opinions in this room, so I'm not sure. But I appreciate the opportunity to provide mine.
Yeah.
It is 38 opinions.
Thank you. By the way, our president stepped out for a moment and our vice president, so I'll run the meeting for a few moments. I saw EJ Caldwell, I believe. Did you have your hand up?
It was. I had a question. Was you included the supplemental slides as you mentioned? Could you walk us through the decision-making framework and maybe provide your insider thoughts? I think it's slide 17.
This
Yeah.
slide right here.
Because, so I assume that pure water would be a project that this would be perfect
Yeah.
for. And you said that this would be, the framework would be ready January 2025. I'm looking at this and I'm trying to figure out in my mind how long a project would take to float through that process. So maybe you could walk us through it and give us your thoughts as far as the timeline of how long a project would take to get through this typically.
Sure. I mean, one thing about this and what we're trying to create is a framework that could be used at multiple different points of development for a project. So the first time Pure Water will go through this will probably be around the time that the draft DIR is being completed. So we'll have quite a bit of information, but it's obviously not all of the information. So the way that this flows is that we would identify projects and programs, and that comes from a lot of different places, a lot of different planning processes that would spit out a project or program that's recommended that we think we should do. Gather the attributes of that project, and then we use the evaluative criteria to score it. Right now, we have that scoring on a scale of 1 to 100. We have higher scores attributed to reliability and resilience as kind of the top two. But we also have adaptability and flexibility, financial sustainability, equity, and environment. And so you get a score. And then one of the other things we really want to do is we want to put a project in context of a portfolio. So we don't just look at one project in isolation, but we look at a project in combination with other things that we know we're doing or that we want to do. So you might look at Pure Water in the context of how does this relate to the state water project dependent drought projects that we're putting on the west side. Is there any connection there? Is there, how does that relate to any groundwater, agreements that we're working on, or so how is that related to any member agency projects or intentions that they have, so that we could actually give some context to that project. And then we will do the modeling piece. I think will actually happen in the evaluative criteria. We're kind of assessing this out right now, but that's basically putting it through that IRP needs assessment and looking at how it would perform in each of those 4 scenarios. How does it help meet our water resource goals? Evaluated for financial impact. I think that's self-explanatory. And then, checking the signposts. Is it still something that we need? Have we done other projects? Have assumptions changed? And then at each phase, the board does make a decision. So again, this could be a final decision. This could be a funding decision. This could be a design decision. It's really gonna vary depending on the stage of the project.
When you mentioned the design decisions, do you foresee projects moving through with multiple design options and each one being considered? And that's the obvious example might be a IPR/DPR pure water project where there's raw water augmentation versus just a simply DPR, direct potable reuse, drinking water augmentation project, and moving those through simultaneously where you could look and evaluate each one.
Yes, I would love that to be the outcome. And I think our board will want that outcome because, our board has actually recently asked that we look at additional potential phasing of pure water, right? So I could see a situation where we'd be able to evaluate a couple different scenarios of a phased approach versus a hybrid or, a few different options. And then the whole point of the decision-making framework is to be able to not just spit out a number, but to be able to compare and to have a consistent way of looking at the different options. So you can see, well, this one, it's going to take longer, but it's going to have greater flexibility or adaptability score, or this one's going to take a shorter amount of time, but it's going to be more expensive or have greater environmental benefits, or, so that would be the ideal. And right now, our internal team of operations and engineering and myself and others are testing the evaluative criteria to kind of fine tune it and figure out how we'd actually use it. And we'll be bringing some examples to our board this year before we finalize the decision-making framework, so they can actually see how we're applying it, how we're utilizing it.
And just for the people that are with us online, the presentation actually has the evaluative criteria as well in the supplemental slides. So
have just one or two other things, but one is really there's a couple comments up front. And one was, I really like what you said, Liz, a few minutes ago about the business model. Obviously, we're rescoping the business model of not just Metropolitan, but probably a number of the agencies because, now, I mean, it can't be all about just we're selling water, right? I mean, water sales are down for various reasons, and some of that's really good because we're all using less water in a lot of ways. So I don't know how we do it, but obviously that's a conversation that the water committee has to have on articulating, those other pieces that are our work, those sort of services we provide and that resiliency. So I'm just putting it out there, but I'm glad that you mentioned that, which goes into this plan and sort of long range vision. The other thing I really enjoyed that you spoke about was capturing the value of conservation, which that always is a tough one. So again, this is just a comment, but I think that we have to think about between Metropolitan and West Basin, all of us, how do we articulate that value of the conservation to our ratepayers, our constituents? Why was that important? Because even in our own pie charts, we always have the conservation piece, but I'll be honest, it's very difficult to explain to our constituents what that exactly means. But I like what you mentioned. We can talk about the value of that stored water because of conservation, et cetera, et cetera. So just again, it's a comment, but I think I'd love to see down the road, how do we better articulate that? And that's part of our communications challenge. Now to a question I have for you, and this will be my last one, I think, but look, at the end of the day, we're all talking about equity. We're talking about how do we make sure that, not one community versus another is left behind. It's really easy to say, it's very hard to do. But as we look at this, especially with Metropolitan being massive, geographically, population-wise, et cetera, you have different member agencies from a very small city to, a water district and maybe even, like a water authority, for example, the city of Los Angeles. And they all got different resources, but they got different priorities, and they've also probably got different agendas, some of them. There might be some communities that really are not that concerned to help out some of the neighbors, if you will. So this is maybe a difficult question to completely answer, but how do you address, that challenge when we look at how all the member agencies really need to be a part of this? And so that, those communities, let's say like Compton and others, for example, that just don't have the bandwidth, or maybe Little San Fernando, how do we look at addressing their needs while, making sure everyone's on board with that?
It's I think the age-old question, how do you really create equity among metropolitan member agencies? And the way that we've defined equity in this plan, we've actually split it up into two different types. So we think about member agency equity and that equitable supply reliability, but also, and that's specific to the state water dependent areas, but also thinking about it in terms of equity across our member agencies. And that is something that comes up at the board all the time. And then we think about the community equity piece. And I think that everyone at Metropolitan, our general manager certainly feels, committed to furthering and advancing equity through the programs and projects that we implement. So I think it's a great question. I will say that there's been, I think it's something that will have to be potentially addressed and discussed in the business model portion of the conversation. I don't really have an answer.
Yeah, it's kind of and maybe it's not so much a question that anybody could just put out there and get an answer, but it's something for sure with dialogue and discussion. And happily, we here in Southern California, I think we think in a bigger, broader perspective on so many issues, but this is one of them, and we're really just trying to confront it along the way. So maybe it's more food for thought, but I'm so glad that we're already at this much, of a place to look at it, let alone, people like me and you and others are, pushing it to staff to help us determine what's the best outcome. And you all are doing a great job to help us figure that out, right? So thank you.
Thank you. Director of the Chief, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. So Liz, how do projects that are developed funded and managed by the agencies fit into this?
So when we run, so our IRP needs assessment, it includes the annual survey that we put out to all of you on which projects you have either implemented or in construction. And so that becomes kind of part of the baseline, right? It's a part of the background. So we assume that those are in the mix. At this point, we've been very clear that the Camp for Water decision-making framework is just to evaluate Metropolitan's projects and programs, not our member agencies. And so I think that, I think that that's been an important distinction for you all, for us to make.
So I get the concept, but presumably there could be a lot of water available. I guess you add the water that as part of the total amount.
The water,
Go ahead.
are you talking the water produced by member agencies?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so that would be part of the baseline assumption of what currently exists. So any targets, any needs would be beyond what we know is already produced locally. The other thing I'll note is when we all talked about the time-bound targets, we set a target related to what is currently existing in our member agencies to maintain that amount. Because that's really important because again, we rely on that. So we rely on the how much water you all produce. We left open the ability to also set a target for new local resource development. So it's possible that we all collectively could say that the member agencies, have these opportunities within their jurisdictions and they plan to produce an additional, million acre or whatever it is. And so, so we could build that in. And then if that was the case, then, that would be something that Metropolitan would help, in my opinion, would help focus on either through our local resources program, through our future supply, funding program. So there's a lot of ways that Metropolitan could the grant program could help support member agencies to do that.
So we've done a fair amount of thinking about that, I assume, because there's a lot of water out there. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I think Director Lefebvre, that's one of the reasons that, Brandon and the Water Resources team is also thinking about the member agency exchange program, surplus management program. So really trying to take advantage of existing infrastructure, like you said, to make sure that we're maximizing those opportunities.
Anything else, Director Lefebvre?
Well, I'll just point out that sites just passed the CEQA hurdle, and so that's the available 400,000 acre feet available when it's finally finished.
Okay. If any other questions from anybody here or?
We get a second bite at the apple?
Yes, I think we get a second, a third, and as many.
So Russ' question leads me. First, congratulations, you guys got $99 million. It's a nice payday. So how was that going to be spent? So assuming that's going to be for pure water, right?
Yes,
I assume it's designated. So what if the board says, nah, we changed our mind. We're going to do sites and not pure water, or we're going to do the Delta conveyance and not pure water. You're going to give the money back?
Well, if we don't use it for pure water, we would have to give it back. That's my understanding.
Okay.
Because it is specifically for.
Hopefully you'll use it for pure water.
But that is
We're all
in the hands of the board.
Yes, I understand. God knows you can never trust politicians. Present company excluded, of course.
Of course. Do you want a fourth bite of the apple now, Director Catherine?
Now I'll save the rest of my questions for later. Thank you.
You are gonna come back for the fourth bite of the apple. Liz, you mentioned the incorporation of, kind of the R&R projects, the CIP projects. And that criteria is being evaluated, but can you expand a little bit more into where you think that, you come back for the recommendation for the board, where that criteria is gonna be? Is it, some of the CIP projects, are pretty mundane, they're moving right along, then
Yeah.
there's others that are not as mundane, but they seem to be moving right along. And so, they're kind of straddling the fence, if you will. And I think there's some people that anticipate that will be part of the camp review process, and others are just figuring that they should just move. So maybe shed a little bit more light how you think that should be addressed.
Yeah, so actually, I was just working with our engineering group this morning on a presentation we're going to be giving to you all in June, where we really lay out in much more detail kind of what will just go directly through the CIP process as opposed to the Camp for Water decision-making framework. And so, hopefully that will be really helpful, but it really is our intent that those R&R projects just continue to move as they have been. In addition to things like the compliance obligations for seismic resilience, emergency management, there's several categories that just need to move through the CIP process. However, the other thing that I think is important for Camp for Water is the whole point of this is to make sure that Metropolitan is looking at everything we do through a climate lens. And so there's also an imperative on us to ensure that even those more mundane or those other categories of projects have something built into them to make sure that we're doing things in a way that's climate resilient. And so that's another thing that we're thinking about as well. But I do hope that when you see this presentation at the end of June, it will become clear kind of the subset of projects that will be evaluated with the camp.
My other question / comment had to do with the business model. And you mentioned that now more it's going to be a parallel track, and that there'll be some interweaving, if you will, but they need to be moved kind of contemporaneously with each other. So in doing so, is there going to be a separation in terms of, and you kind of mentioned it, but in terms of focusing on the business model so that really is available by 2025? I think this year, when we were looking at just the budget, it became very apparent that there were some decisions in terms of how we want to conduct business in the future, or how Met should be conducting business in the future. And that we kind of developed that on the fly this year, but the better guidance would be in place. So maybe comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah.
Tracking.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion would be that, I think there is real pressure, especially based on what you all had to go through for this last budget to make some adjustments. I think what is probably the most likely is that we lay out sort of a roadmap, and we're able to make some changes here in the near term, and then lay out some of the further steps and analyses that need to happen. And again, I still think about it in terms of those three kind of buckets of like rates and charges, cost containment efficiencies, and new revenue sources. So new revenue sources, for example, like I think we can identify some really concrete ways to address that. But that's not all going to be done by the end of this year, right? That's something that we're going to have to develop. We'll probably have to do some studies around like energy opportunities. And but I think it seems to me like what this next conversation is going to be is probably going to be around the rates and charges and cost of containment and efficiency, hopefully within the next 6-7 months.
Well, thank you. No other questions? All right. So with that, I think, we are basically wrapping this up. Any board member comments in general? Yeah. Then we're adjourned.
Yeah.